Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be talking about a massive severe weather outbreak that'll stretch from the Midwest back through the southern plains tomorrow. This will bring the threat for strong tornadoes, damaging winds, and large to very large hail. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today that will lead into that threat for severe weather tomorrow, which we're going to begin with the Rocky Mountains. This is where that low pressure system is currently located, which will bring the threat for severe weather tomorrow. What this will do over the next 24 hours is slowly move up to the north and northeast towards Iowa and Minnesota. It'll center itself right back up here into Iowa and Minnesota, and that'll eventually allow for very strong southerly winds to pull a ton of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico, which will set up a pretty large threat for severe weather, which will extend from anywhere from Texas all the way back through the Midwest as we go into tomorrow. When we put this low pressure system into motion tonight, you'll notice that there's a pretty large area of snow ongoing in the mountainous regions over back in the Rocky Mountains, and this will actually continue. We are monitoring a threat for a winter storm and blizzard over the northern plains over the next 48 hours, but the bigger concern for the United States will definitely be the severe weather potential, because once we head into Tuesday afternoon and evening, that is when a very strong low pressure system will develop over the central and northern portions of the country. This will again pull a ton of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico, very strong winds right behind that low pressure system, and this is just going to create havoc here across the country with very strong winds right behind the frontal boundary. That will create blowing snow and a blizzard. Meanwhile, the threat for severe weather will extend from Texas all the way back through the Midwest across a very large area of the country. So once we go into Tuesday night, that is when severe weather will begin to ramp up across Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, and then we'll be watching for a second round of storms going into the overnight hours Tuesday into Wednesday for a nocturnal threat for severe weather. That means a nighttime threat for severe storms capable of damaging winds, large hail, and tornadoes overnight Tuesday into Wednesday. And you can notice here that line of storms across even southern Minnesota back through Kansas and eventually going closer to the overnight hours Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. That is when that line of storms will actually extend as far south as Texas. So this is a massive low pressure system, almost identical to what we just saw this past Friday with that tornado outbreak, but there are some key differences that I'm going to go over in this forecast to give you an idea of what's actually going to happen in comparison to what we saw on Friday, because they are not the same at this point. So in terms of the threat level, we are at a moderate risk of severe weather across two different areas. Again, this does not look a whole lot different from what we just saw on Friday, but the two moderate risks of severe weather, one of which is in Iowa, northwest portions of Illinois, and northeastern Missouri. This is where we could see a few strong tornadoes in addition to damaging winds and large hail. Further to the south, back through Missouri and as well as Arkansas, that is where another moderate risk of severe weather exists. This is again another region that we could see some significant tornado action along with some large hail and damaging wind gusts. The tornado threat has increased since the last update this morning from the Storm Prediction Center. We now have two hatched areas of a tornado risk, which means the threat for an EF2 plus tornado does exist in both regions. So make sure you have multiple ways to receive alerts tomorrow and go over that tornado action plan tonight and not tomorrow. Do not wait on that at this point. And further to the south, there's actually now an increased tornado potential across Missouri all the way back through even eastern Oklahoma, including a large chunk of Arkansas. This is an increased tornado threat now up to 15% chance within a 25-mile radius of a tornado. So make sure you have your tornado action plan in place tonight ahead of tomorrow's severe weather. And the hail threat is actually going to be increased back up into the Midwest, believe it or not. This is where we very well could see some large to very large hail. The chances are much higher to the north, mainly due to the fact the temperatures aloft will actually be cooler. As you know, there will be a potential for a winter storm up there, so colder air naturally will be a part of this area. That is why that large hail threat is so much higher back up closer to the Midwest. But again, we could very well see hail upwards of apple size out of a storm or two. So again, make sure you take those proper precautions tonight. Bring your vehicle inside, cover plants, do all that sort of stuff so you are prepared ahead of tomorrow's severe weather. Damaging wind threat is not nearly as high as what we saw back on Friday, so keep that in mind. We do not have any hatched areas, which would mean that we'd be talking about 70+ mile per hour damaging winds across at least a scattered region. In this case, we're just looking at 60 to 75 mile per hour damaging winds in this region, which would be about a 30% chance within a 25-mile radius. So the damaging wind threat is slightly lower, but you want to still make sure you're taking those precautions now, because that is still a medium threat of damaging winds. If you watch my weather forecast quite often, you know that I provide honest forecasts, so I do want to give you an in-depth look at what we're actually talking about tomorrow and what could make tomorrow very significant, but what could also make this a lot less significant than what it looks. So we're going to begin with the jet stream. This is our upper level winds, and going into late Tuesday, that is when very strong upper level winds will start to take over from the Midwest back through the southern plains. What this will help to do is keep intensifying these supercells and basically keeping the updrafts much stronger, which is basically what we're looking at with these supercells. Updrafts can also create a lot larger hail, and that is a big concern here across the Midwest, especially where those upper level winds will likely be very strong. Back through Arkansas, they are still strong, but the strongest of the upper level winds right now are currently forecasted to be back up in the Midwest, which again, the large hail threat has increased. In addition to that, the tornado potential, I think at least, is a little bit higher. Now, in terms of the low level jet, this is what helps rotate supercells. So once we go down into 700 millibars going into Tuesday afternoon and evening, the low level jet across the Midwest is around 50 to 60 knots. That is a very strong low level jet, which means rotating supercells becomes much more likely across this region. Further down to the south across Arkansas and southern Missouri, once we go into late Tuesday into Wednesday in the overnight hours, that is when that nocturnal severe weather threat begins. That is where we could be talking about a low-level jet between 45 to 55 knots, which again is still a strong low-level jet. So we'll have to watch that area closely for some rotating supercells, and the tornado potential does obviously match up with this threat. There is a 15% probability here across eastern Iowa, western Illinois, and as well as going into northeast Missouri. Now, there are plenty of reasons to be concerned about the tornado risk tomorrow, but I do want to give you an idea of what's actually going to happen. We're going to begin with the significant tornado parameter, which this gives us an idea of, on a scale of 0 to 10, the tornado risk. 0 being the very lowest tornado risk, all the way up to 10, which is the highest tornado threat that we can really get on this computer model. By the afternoon hours of Tuesday, that is when values upwards of 6 to 7 appear across Illinois and eastern Iowa. This is where the most significant tornado risk is currently in place going into Tuesday afternoon and evening, and eventually going into the overnight hours, right along that second round of storms, that line of storms, values are still upwards of 2 to 3. That is when another tornado threat may exist. But there is reason to not be fully concerned. One, there will be a cap in place to some extent across the Midwest, which may prevent some convection from developing. Another thing to keep in mind is that there will be some weak elevated showers and storms during the late morning that could cause a little bit of sinking air, which may prevent some of the severe weather across the Midwest. So once we get closer to about 2 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, look back down to the south here across Missouri, that is when storms begin to fire up. But notice it's not nearly as widespread as what we just saw on Friday. Big reason why is because of that sinking air, a bit of a cap as well, and this setup is not going to be fully in place until later in the evening hours, which is when that second round of storms will develop. So some discrete supercells are possible during the afternoon hours. These are usually going to be the ones that produce a higher tornado risk, damaging wind threat, and also the large to very large hail concern. But you might notice on the HRR model, it's all combined together here across the Midwest. And really with this, I'm not nearly as concerned about a tornado risk if all these storms stay together, because that will overall share the energy amongst the storms, creating more of a hail potential instead of the tornado risk. But still be mindful that these storms, if they do become discrete, very well could quickly form a tornado risk. Once we get closer to around dinner time, storms will still be ongoing. We may see additional supercells develop as well, maybe another round of storms, kind of like a mini round of storms in between that line of storms, going closer to around 8 to 9 o'clock across Iowa, and eventually going closer to the overnight hours. That is when a linear line of storms will develop. That is where we could also see a bit of an increased tornado risk if that's able to really develop with the instability also in place. Further to the south, again, there is an increased tornado potential from southern Missouri back through southeast Oklahoma. In this area, the tornado parameter values are also still very notable, especially going closer to when that line of storms develops going into the overnight hours. Values upwards of 4, 5, even 6 are possible, which still indicates a medium to high tornado risk across those areas. So in terms of the timing, we'll be watching for 2 rounds of storms down here as well. The first will potentially develop during the evening hours if it's able to overcome a cap. This area could see a couple of discrete cells, but if it does not overcome the cap, we're not really going to have much of a round 1 of storms. By around the evening hours and overnight hours, that is when this line of storms will develop closer to midnight. This is where we could see some numerous to widespread damaging winds, large hail, and maybe a few embedded tornadoes. And eventually going closer to the morning hours on Wednesday, storms will still continue to march out to the east and northeast, which severe weather may still remain possible. And the southern plains will still be dealing with a severe weather threat of their own. There could be a few cells overnight that develop. These will produce large hail primarily east of the DFW metroplex fourplex. That is where we could see some large to very large hail and damaging winds. Potentially an isolated tornado or two still does exist there. And eventually going into Wednesday afternoon, storms still ongoing, but for the most part, those will not be severe. Also, I do want to give you a heads up. I will likely be live tonight going over a forecast discussion on tomorrow's severe weather outbreak potential. So make sure you're subscribed down below and click the bell icon so you're notified when I go live. And we'll also be discussing the day 3 outlook in depth for you on that live stream as well. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed this forecast. This forecast is brought to you by Platinum Contracting.